Okay, hello everyone, welcome. I'll just give people another minute to trickle in. Let's see. Okay, and as people are heading into our Zoom meeting program for the night, I do just want to let everyone know, we host Art on Thursdays once a month, and just to give everyone a heads up, next month we're doing Art on Thursdays, Revolutionary Design, Modern Architecture in New England. So please keep an eye out on our calendar, check that out. We're so happy that you all keep coming back every time. So welcome back to all of you who have been here before, and welcome to all the newcomers. My name is Gianna. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Chelmsford Public Library. So I will do just a brief introduction on tonight's presentation and introduce our host, and we'll get it started. So tonight we are learning about Marc Chagall. So Marc Chagall's colorful abstract paintings integrate a variety of elements from the modernist movements of the early 20th century. His work is singular among his peers for its incorporation of Jewish themes, reflecting the artist's cultural roots. This program provides an introduction to Chagall's personal and professional resilience, his work, and favorite subjects. And tonight our presenter is Jane O'Neill. She is the founder of Culturally Curious, an arts education consulting firm specializing in art appreciation programs. She curates and delivers programs throughout New England and beyond. O'Neill holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. And for more information, please check out iamculturallycurious.com. I'll be sure to put a link to that in the chat, as well as a link to the registration for next month's program. So keep an eye out. And without further ado, let me pass it over to Jane.
Thanks, Gianna. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Marc Chagall. I have a feeling if you're anything like me, you're just going to fall deeply in love with this wonderful artist, and you've had a chance to sort of feast your eyes on this great work that's on the screen. It's a little bit of a preview of what you're going to see tonight. We'll be getting back to this image. But just as sort of a quick intro, we think of Marc Chagall as an artist with two basic reputations. One of them is a pioneer of modernism in the 20th century, and the other one is as a Jewish artist. And tonight we're going to get to know him beyond those reputations and get a sense for his broad array of talents. He worked in a number of different media, his unique artistic perspective, and his enduring optimism. And I think you can get a sense of that right here with this photograph of the artist smiling out at us, standing in his studio behind his paintbrushes and his materials here. This just gives you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our next hour together. We'll start off with a quick introduction to the artist, and then we'll turn our attention to, like I said, his distinctive and unique take on modernism. He sort of runs through the gamut of different styles and then decides what works best for him. As a Jewish artist, he incorporates Jewish themes and Russian Jewish life really into his artwork. We'll see how that plays out. And then a section so nice, I named it twice: Color and Joy and Love and Levitation. This is probably the area that people most love about Marc Chagall's work. Of course, it isn't all easy in his life. He dealt with extreme anti-Semitism, and we'll talk about his life in exile, finish up with Peace, Performance, and Stained Glass Windows, and the artist's death and legacy. So much to cover here. So let's get started with the artist's life and introduction to Marc Chagall. Okay. So whenever we're thinking about Marc Chagall or thinking about his life, we have to get started with where he grew up. And he grew up, I should say he was born in 1887 in the Russian Empire, in an area which is now Belarus, so outlined in red on the map here. But it was the little town of Vitebsk that is really where he grew up. And this was highly segregated away from the rest of Russian life. As a Jewish citizen, he was in every way a second-class citizen. This is the home that he grew up in. It's now a museum that features some of his work. But with this slide here, I really do want to emphasize what his life was like as somebody who was Jewish living in Russia as a young person. He wrote that as a boy, I felt at every step that I was a Jew, that people made me feel it. So his movement, his daily life, it was in every way restricted. And essentially, the Jews that were relegated to this section of the Russian Empire, sort of the Pale of Settlement, as it's known, were living in financial dire straits. Everybody there was impoverished and just sort of eking out an existence. It was not an easy life. Now, referring to his hometown, Chagall wrote, "It was a strange town, an unhappy town, a boring town," but we'll see that it looms very large as a subject or setting in his paintings. Now, just to give you a sense of his childhood, he was the oldest of 9 children. We can see him over here at the top left of this family photograph. His father worked in a herring warehouse. We think that's why fish appear quite a bit in his imagery, and his mother managed a small grocery store. So he, as a young person, saw how hard they worked and really imagined a different life for himself. Now, his family nominally adhered to Hasidism. So that meant that forbade the representation of any of God's creatures. So there was absolutely no art in their household. So that means that Marc Chagall grew up in an environment that was devoid of images, of art making, and the concept of making art was totally foreign to him. Now, as a Jew, that meant that he could only attend religious schooling. He wasn't allowed to go to like the regular schools, but to his benefit, his mother actually ended up bribing a teacher for him so that he could attend a regular high school and get an education beyond the Bible. So while he was attending this school, he saw a peer who was just kind of drawing in one of his notebooks. And he described that as being like a vision or a revelation in black and white. And he was basically like, how do you do this? His peer just said, go to the library and start, copying pictures from the books. And it was because of that first significant experience that Marc Chagall ends up going to an art school in Vitebsk. And we can see him here with the other art students. Here he is at the center with his arms folded. This is his instructor here, an artist named Yehuda Penn, who created this image of Marc Chagall. Apparently, he liked Chagall so much that he did not even charge him to attend this first art school. And as much as Chagall was really enthralled by the fact that he could attend art school, he didn't love the training. He wasn't interested in becoming an academic artist. So he left the school and decided to seek training elsewhere. So that is when Marc Chagall actually has the opportunity to leave this small village that he grew up in. And he goes to the big city. He's 19 years old and he's headed to St. Petersburg, which I'm using the stand-in of this famous building from St. Petersburg here. Now, this was a city that was known for its famous art schools, and it was also a city that Jews were not allowed to freely move around in. So he had to get sort of a special passport in order to go to St. Petersburg and attend art school. And he was desperately poor while he was there, sometimes even passing out due to collapsing really from his hunger. Now, he also didn't like the training that he was getting while he was in St. Petersburg. He had another instructor who was incredibly fond of him, who described Marc Chagall as somebody who would listen very carefully to all of his instruction as an instructor, and then he would pick up his materials and get ready to do the assignment, and then would go and do the exact opposite of what was assigned. So clearly he was a free thinker from the get-go. But now here he is in a city that is completely foreign to him. It's unlike his experiences growing up. And this is when he starts to create images that are really inspired by his childhood. This is a painting from 1909 called Russian Wedding. And we begin to see some of Marc Chagall's favorite themes in this picture right here. First of all, there's a wedding, there's the theme of love. This wedding procession is being led by a fiddler, and we're going to see a lot more fiddlers throughout the evening here. And it's also set in a Russian Jewish village. So we see people going about the work of daily life. In this particular scene, we also see that they've stopped to take in the spectacle of this happy day. But the village itself is marked by these, humble residences. In some cases, they almost look ramshackle here. Now, even though the themes are present, the themes that Marc Chagall will sort of keep with for the rest of his life, the colors are muted. They're a little bit muddy here. And we can see they're really rooted in his memories. Of course, Marc Chagall will go on to have this kind of brilliant, almost a kaleidoscopic color palette, but we don't quite see that yet. I will say about the fiddling, because it becomes such a prominent theme for him. Marc Chagall was himself really interested in learning how to play the fiddle as a young person, but in the end, it was the arts that really spoke to him. So he's barely subsisting in St. Petersburg, and he decides to move to Paris. Now, this was a risky move for him, and it was something that had to be underwritten with a very meager stipend from somebody in the Russian government, but he manages to make his way to Paris. And shortly before he leaves, he creates this self-portrait. I should mention that he creates a number, probably dozens of self-portraits throughout his life. And they are wonderful because he looks so different in almost every single one of them. I love his barely contained excitement here. And also the fact that he's wearing an artist's beret and how he's got his hand raised almost to his chest, but with those paintbrushes sort of spreading out across his chest, extending their way to his heart. Now, he was enthralled to live in Paris. He loved the museums. He loved the galleries. This was the place for him. And we'll be circling back to his time in Paris once we start going through his body of work. But I will say, in addition to wearing the beret here, he also starts experimenting with wearing makeup. He's wearing blush and eyeshadow. It's all a part of looking like an artist, but it's interesting to think of people doing this about 100 or so years ago. Enter now Bella. Bella is Bella Rosenfeld, who was a woman who also grew up in Vitebsk, the small Russian Jewish village that he grew up in. She was actually from the wealthiest family in that village, and she would become the love of his life. She was his wife, his muse, and really in every way his collaborator. He would say that his paintings weren't finished until Bella sort of gave her approval. He described their first meeting. He said, "Her silence is mine, her eyes are mine. It is as if she knows everything about my childhood, my present, my future, as if she can see right through me." And Bella, in her own right, was a writer, and she described their first meeting. She said, "When you catch a glimpse of his eyes, they are as blue as if they'd fallen straight out of the sky. They were strange eyes, long and almond-shaped, and each seemed to sail along by itself like a little boat." So you can imagine that these two romantics really connected with each other. Marc Chagall returns from Paris to Vitebsk to marry Bella in 1915. They're trapped there because of the Russian Revolution, and or I should say they're trapped there really by the First World War, and they have their daughter the following year. So they are really in a front row seat for the Russian revolutions. And Marc Chagall actually welcomed the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, not just because it made him as a Jew a full citizen of Russia, but because it recognized him as an artist as well. And in this brief kind of heady moment, avant-garde art became the new establishment in Russian art. And Marc Chagall was offered, prestigious roles in the Russian art world. world. But that opinions quickly changed and hardened against him. And Marc Chagall was forced to resign a post that he had taken on. He found his artwork unwelcome in Russia. And he said that the new regime had turned the Russian Empire upside down the way I turn my pictures. So this is another self-portrait from 1917, where you can see he's painting his village on the surface of a canvas, sort of turning it upside down with little houses and goats kind of flying off of the surface of the canvas. We can also see this kind of grim severity in his facial expression here. He seems like a different person. He certainly doesn't have those smiling eyes that we were first introduced to. Now, following the end of World War I, Chagall and his family moved to Paris, and that's where his work thrives, his family life thrives. And it really isn't until the rise of the Nazi regime in World War II and the anti-Semitic beliefs of the Nazi Party that his career and his life are once again really threatened. Marc Chagall's work was confiscated, it was publicly disparaged, and in some cases, it was destroyed. Now, to add to the stress and sadness of that particularly challenging time in the artist's life, his beloved Bella here sadly passes away just before the end of World War II after 29 years of marriage. Now, Marc Chagall does not spend the rest of his life alone. He has a long love affair with a woman named Virginia Haggard, who was a Briton who we see over here on the left. They have a son together named David. And then after 7 years, Virginia actually leaves him. I think he was, his ego was a little bit bruised, but he recovers and marries a woman named Valentina Brodsky, who you can see over here on the right. And they spend the rest of their lives together. She came from a similar Russian Jewish background, and I think had a steadying influence on his life during that later part of his career. He referred to her as my joy and my delight. So just to quickly wrap up on Marc Chagall's life, we have another self-portrait over here with those kind of almond-shaped eyes that Bella had written about. And Marc Chagall's career spanned about 75 years. And during that time, he produced close to 10,000 works of art. He achieved fortune and fame. And by the end of the 20th century, almost a sense of ubiquity. His artwork, you could find it anywhere, really. And despite this, he avoided the spotlight. He never wanted to be a celebrity. And sometimes when people would recognize him in public and say, hey, are you Chagall? Are you that famous painter? He would sort of smile mischievously and point to somebody else and say, maybe that's him. So he was always kind of redirecting. Now, through it all, Chagall remained true to the themes that were important to him, including love, his Russian Jewish heritage, and a set of personally significant symbols described again and again through the artist's unique style. He used joyful colors all along the way. And as we'll see, in this image and many more very unique compositions. So we have a self-portrait here with Paris in the background. Notre Dame is recognizable in the bridges of Paris, but we also have a giant rooster and a bride who seems to be sort of floating on Marc Chagall's head. All of this might make a little bit more sense as we move through tonight's program. So let's turn our attention to that unique style and get a better understanding of how Marc Chagall arrived at it. Okay. So we have this sense that he was living in Russia, he moves to Paris, he moves back to Russia, but then back to Paris. In this first visit to Paris, before he's met Bella, when he's still a young man who's struggling and incredibly impoverished, Marc Chagall goes to really the heart of the art world, and it's a transformative experience for him. Here we see another self-portrait. This is from 1914. Again, he looks like a completely different person here. And on the right, we have a famous building. It's now famous. It's called La Ruche, or it was known as the Beehive. And it was, some people call it an artist colony, but really in truth, it was very cheap housing where people lived in studios that didn't have running water or any heat. And drifters would come and live there, and nobody would ever really get evicted. So there were drunks, there were misfits, and all sorts of drifters there. But it was a place where a lot of Jewish artists who are now very well-known artists who were escaping violent regimes in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. They would come, and this was really their refuge. And it was a place where Marc Chagall found this wonderful sense of community, even though the conditions were inhospitable, to say the least. So other artists who were there for a time included Modigliani and Ferdinand Leger, and they were all equally impoverished. Marc Chagall was said to have subsisted on poetry and coffee alone. So during the day, he would find any job that could pay him some money, and then he would paint all night, apparently in the nude, so that he wouldn't ruin any of his clothes. He once said, "In La Ruche, you died or you came out famous." So let's see how he came out of La Ruche. What were some of the experiments, and where did they come from? This is another self-portrait. It dates to 1914. Marc Chagall's living in this intensely creative environment. He's exposed to all these new ideas related to modern art, and we see him kind of trying on these different styles and seeing what fits. Here we can see that he has elongated his form. He's got this giraffe-like neck and a very long torso. He's taking up the entire sort of vertical axis of this painting. And he's turned himself a little bit into this tragic figure here as he's painting this work of art. There's something very somber about this image, also in part due to the very muted color palette. It's just browns and blues. Every time I look at this kind of somber mood that emanates from this self-portrait reminds me of Pablo Picasso and his blue period, which was a period that the artist went through about 10 years before Marc Chagall painted this self-portrait. But here with The Blind Man's Meal from 1903, we can see Picasso kind of working through similar ideas, the exaggeration or the elongation of form in order to emphasize the tragic nature of this figure that he's depicting. Very muted color palette, or I should say a constrained color palette with just the blues and the beiges over here. And he uses this to great effect to create this sense of melancholy and tragedy with these figures. And I think Marc Chagall is borrowing heavily from Picasso here. Now, with this next image from Chagall, we can see him experimenting with color. And this is really where Marc Chagall shines. This is a painting called Jew in Green, also from 1914. And this is where we begin to see Chagall inserting this kind of radiant color into his paintings. We're looking at this solitary figure here. There's a fair amount of realism in the way that he's described the face, except for, of course, the fact that the face is bright Kelly green. And then along with that, we get the sense that this is a man who is further along in his years. We would expect to see gray or white hair, and instead it's this bright yellow. So he's defying our expectations in terms of color here. Everything else is very much muted in the color. And where do experiments like this come from? Well, I would argue, and I think the rest of the artistic world would probably agree, that Marc Chagall was exposed to the ideas of fauvism and expressionism. Artists like Henri Matisse, who we can see here in a portrait by a fellow fauvist named André Derain. These artists were utilizing color. They refer to it almost as like sticks of dynamite. Now, we take it very much for granted today that an artist could pick up a palette of paint and could paint virtually any recognizable object in any single color that they choose. But this was very much considered revolutionary in the first decade or so of the 20th century. The idea that you would paint someone's face with green in it was really unheard of until artists like Matisse and Derain came along. And so here Marc Chagall is adopting it wholeheartedly and thinking, I'm going to use this color that is not naturalistic in any way, but it sort of has this explosive force in my works of art. So it's fauvist artists like Matisse that really opened this door for Chagall to be much more adventurous with his color. Now, with this next self-portrait by Chagall, it's called Self-Portrait with 7 Digits from 1913. We can see him sort of putting together all of the pieces here. There is, of course, the Eiffel Tower in the background, which doesn't just signify that he's in Paris, it signifies that he's like a modern man. So, incorporating the Eiffel Tower into his works has kind of a dual purpose here. Uh, with this work, we see the exaggeration of the human figure. We see these strange distortions in the body, the use of anti-naturalistic color, and of course, this kind of fragmentation. Look at how the forearms are connected to the upper arm. In this case, a tiny little elbow here. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that Chagall is using shading and light in strange ways here. So this what looks like maybe a forearm or the cuff of a sleeve is shaded along the top here. Over on the other side, it's shaded along the bottom. So he is simultaneously suggesting three-dimensionality with this kind of shading, but also destroying it because it's inconsistent. So I would argue that he is very much being influenced by Cubism, this revolutionary style that was brought in by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. And we can see a great example of Cubism over here on the left with Girl with the Mandolin from 1910. So really just a couple of years before Chagall paints the self-portrait with 7 digits. Now, you can see that Picasso has fragmented this figure almost beyond recognition. Easy to understand in these days because we all have cardboard boxes from Amazon that we've all had the experience of sort of breaking apart and flattening. And really, that's the way Picasso was thinking of the world. Every part of our body could be a little box from Amazon that he could then flatten out for us. And I think you can see Chagall sort of playing with that notion, especially in the way that he is fragmenting the planes of his own face here. Now, Picasso and Braque, they use a radically reduced color palette here. For the most part, they're just painting in blacks, whites, grays, and tans. It's really all about form and the flattening of form and the fragmentation of form. But Chagall will never abandon color. He said, let them eat their fill of square pears on their triangular tables. And he went on to develop a fragmentation that was really all his own. And so it's about color, it's about fragmentation. And I think that first slide that we started with tonight, this beautiful picture called Paris Through the Window from 1913, really shows how Marc Chagall has internalized so much of what was happening in modern art and then made a style that was all his own. So we can see, especially in the sky here, that he is fragmenting space, he's fragmenting light. We have, triangles and other shapes in the sky. We can see in the frame of this window the colors of the rainbow. Really, he's using all of this color, and he's even created a face with two or a head with two faces, one of them bright blue. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that there is a flying figure over here who sort of looks like they're floating from the bottom of a triangle. This will not be the first of his floating or flying figures. We also see other elements of this picture that are inverted, like the train over here, these figures that look like they're kind of walking sideways along the street. Obviously, they're sort of out of scale with the rest of the picture too. So there's a lot here that is a precursor to the way Chagall will work. And if you have very good eyes, I want to draw your attention to the fact that kind of emerging from this Eiffel Tower in this reddish pink triangle here, you can just barely see the head of a cow. And this is going to take us into our next section here, which is called Russian Jewish Themes. So I think when it comes to Marc Chagall, artists, audiences, art historians, everybody sort of wants to nail down the specifics of what of how you can see his Judaism in his artwork. And for the most part, it's really that you can see his Russian Jewish heritage in his artwork because he becomes so enamored with the depiction and the inclusion of elements of his childhood in his paintings. In fact, you can't separate for Marc Chagall, you can't separate his modernism from the idea of kind of Jewish folk culture. It is one and the same for him. So we are looking at a picture here called I in the Village from 1911. And I and the Village is a little bit of a play on words, because we can see presumably the figure of Marc Chagall here, this giant green face and profile, gazing into the face of what is maybe a cow, maybe a sheep. Forgive me for not being able to recognize livestock that well. But you can see that there is a little line connecting their actual eyeballs here. So there's like an intense stare down that's happening. But we also notice that there is a profound fragmentation of space. There's the use of anti-naturalistic colors, and there are floating figures. There are houses that are upside down. Even here, it seems as though we're looking through the face of this animal to see a cow that's being milked, or perhaps it's just represented on the cheek of that animal. In the bottom foreground, the figure of Chagall is holding this plant, sometimes referred to as sort of like a tree of life, but I don't think we can necessarily pin down that definition there, but it does seem to have a variety of blossoms on it. And then in the background, we see a man with a scythe who's walking forward, maybe even communicating with this woman who also seems to be hovering upside down here. So what is going on? We see some of that Cubist influence here. We definitely see the Fauvist influence here. And we see Marc Chagall putting it all through this filter, this lens of his childhood. So in some cases, well, I think throughout Marc Chagall's life, you're going to see not necessarily a strict reference to Judaism, but really kind of a mix of religious traditions. If you have really good eyes, you might have already noticed that the figure that is often believed to be him is wearing a little cross around his neck. There's also Orthodox churches in many of his paintings from this time period. So it's not that it's strictly Judaism, but it's a new way of thinking about Judaism really in the 20th century, that being Jewish isn't necessarily being religious, that it can also just be about the cultural aspect of Judaism. And that's what we see Marc Chagall really exploring in these works. Now, another famous painting from the same time period, which I just adore, this is his 1912 painting of a fiddler. And I think it transports us to this fantasy, this memory of his childhood in the village of Vitebsk. As we look at this picture. Now, there's all sorts of kind of whimsical elements about this. I think right off the bat, we notice that the fiddler's face is green, his beard is blue. This is Chagall playing with these modern elements, these Fauvist elements. This fiddler is on top of the roof of this tiny building. He seems to sort of be dancing here. We notice that there's these dramatic shifts in scale and perspective throughout the picture. Another Orthodox church in the background. We have these stacked figures here who seem to be looking up into the clouds at what seems to be the vision of a saint. I also love these tiny little footprints in the snow around this picture here. Now, this will take us right back to the fact that Marc Chagall has been painting fiddlers from the beginning, and now he's really expanding the way he's painting fiddlers. And I should mention too that he paints fiddlers for really the rest of his artistic career. This one here in the center, I believe, is from 1913, and this is called The Violinist from 1947. So sometimes the mood changes ever so slightly. This is more sort of a peaceful nocturne over here. But with this picture, we have, these similar ideas of the snowy landscape in the background, the fragmentation of space, particularly in this wonderful purple jacket here. Now, if you're already thinking about the music from Fiddler on the Roof, if it's already going through your head, there is a connection here. The hit Broadway musical, the title for it actually was inspired by Marc Chagall's paintings, because he actually depicts fiddlers on roofs here. And the original Broadway set was also inspired by Marc Chagall's paintings here too. That I think is the extent of the connection. But if you have, a few fiddler songs stuck in your head right now, you're probably not alone. Now, when it comes to Chagall and depictions of religious themes, I think another area where he is sort of closely connected in people's minds is his depiction of the Old Testament. He was commissioned to do a whole series on the Bible beginning in 1930. There was a famous Russian art dealer, or sorry, Parisian art dealer named Ambroise Vollard, who commissioned Chagall to take on this project. And it became expansive. It actually took him about 25 years to finish. It was over 100 images. They were sort of delicate etchings. What we're looking at here is a watercolor that he did over one of these etchings. Chagall was so inspired by this whole assignment, really, that he ends up traveling to Israel to experience the Holy Land for himself. He ends up spending about 2 months there. And some art critics even sort of point to the idea that some of the figures that he created are really very much rooted in the people that he met while he was there. Now, I mentioned it took him about 25 years to finish this project. There was, of course, a world war in the interim, but when he finally exhibited them, they were published in an art magazine. They were exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And people went crazy over these images because they're emotive, they're distinctly modern, and they're excellent in their storytelling. This is the story of the Abraham and Isaac, and we have this biblical figure who is instructed by God to sacrifice his son, and he's ready and willing to do it. And then an angel comes and intercedes and saves the son's life. Some other familiar stories from the Old Testament. This is an angel coming to Noah to instruct him to build the ark. And then over here, we have God handing down the tablets, the rule of law, really, to Moses, who's got the rays of light shining from the top of his head here. And of course, God is obscured. He's just these hands over here. So they're delicate, but really powerful in their storytelling. Chagall said, "I did not see the Bible, I dreamed it. Ever since early childhood, I've been captivated by the Bible. It has always seemed to me, and still seems today, the greatest source of poetry of all time." And art critics generally agree that if Marc Chagall had produced nothing else during his entire life, that he would have been considered still one of the greatest modern artists of all time because of this series. Now, let's turn our attention to what Chagall is probably best known for, his pictures of love and joy. Now, he has been a little bit criticized for being maybe a little too sentimental, but I have to tell you, I'm a romantic and I am a sucker for everything we are about to look at. This is Marc Chagall's painting, The Birthday, from 1915. This was painted just a few weeks before he married Bella. Now, they had met at a party in 1909, and he had fallen in love with her at first sight. He said, "It's as if we've known each other for a long, long time, and she knows everything about me. And I realized she would be my wife." So in this fantastic scene here, we can see the figure of Bella, the figure of Chagall, sort of rising like these bubbles kind of floating off of the ground here. And her eyes are wide open as though she's so surprised by this kiss. Chagall's body is turned away from her, and his whole sort of upper body is bent backwards, impossibly, of course. His neck twists so that he can connect lip to lip here. He has presumably just given her these flowers. There was already a romantic mood, but before they could even move away from each other, they begin to levitate in this moment. And there's a whole new level to their passion for each other, to their love. Now, beyond the sweetness of this scene, we also have the details of their life in this room here, the wonderful repetition of certain forms on the table, as part of the table, even the stool over here, the details of their life outside the window, and then all of these little patterns that he has painstakingly created in this setting. They are just gorgeous. Now, there's several images of Chagall and Bella kind of floating through the air. This is Promenade from 1917, and this is called Over the Town from 1918. I particularly love this scene over here on the left. It's as though they just stood up from their picnic here. And as they stood up, it's almost as like she's a helium balloon just rising off of the ground, weightless, because of this joy that she feels that when she's with him. And he feels just the same way. He's smiling out at us. He's holding her hand. I don't think he's holding her down. Look at his heels here. I think he's just about to float away with her. There's even, I think, a little bird in his hand. So this notion of flying is reinforced there. The painting over the town, I think, has a slightly different mood. They are these monumental figures. They are floating over their hometown here, Vitebsk. And we can see the details of the little houses, the barns, the animals, that sort of thing. And they're in this kind of slightly awkward position. You could almost imagine them kind of lying in a bed in this position here. And there isn't that same sort of triumphant joy that we see as over here in the promenade. But in the end, there is a sense of kind of a floating reverie in both of these pictures. Now, as I was ruminating on the promenade the other day, it reminded me of some dance that I'd seen in a movie at some point, and it turns out that it was a Woody Allen movie from the 1990s called Everybody Says I Love You. And here's Woody Allen and Goldie Hawn dancing in Paris along the Seine. And she does this whole routine where she is weightless, just like Bella, and it's pretty extraordinary. You can definitely look it up on YouTube. It's a wonderful dance sequence. Now, if we continue on with Chagall and these romantic themes that he has, we'll often see very large bouquets of flowers, symbols of love and romance in his compositions. And whenever we see them, he also tends to include these dramatic shifts of scale and perspective. So over here on the left, we have The Woman in the Roses from 1929, and we have this beautiful elongated female nude kind of resting on these flowers that makes this vase of roses seem absolutely enormous. And of course, it's dwarfing this small village over here, the tiny building in the background, and this lone figure on a boat down below. But this theme of love just emanates from the picture. On the right, we have another image called The Bouquet with Flying Lovers. So you can see a few more of, or these familiar flying, levitating figures that he innovated in the 19-teens, incorporated over here. And he's much more intentional with including the symbols from his childhood. We have the rooster over here. We've got a goat playing, I think, something like a violin up in the upper left. And then the references to that same village, another figure in a rowboat here. So whenever possible, the animals, the village life are brought in to remind us of his first love and his feeling of falling in love. Now, as we look at these images together, all in sequence here, you might be thinking, wow, you know, these are strange pictures, especially if you look at this one. This is called The Bridal Pair with the Eiffel Tower from 1939. And we see another floating couple here, a happy couple on their wedding day. We see another fiddler because they're always involved in important life events. But we also see a giant rooster. And of course, when you incorporate a figure like that, things just sort of start to devolve almost. It's like nothing really makes sense as we look at a picture like this. So you might be thinking, how does all of this relate to something like the surrealist movement, where artists are really interested in, you know, pulling together different objects that don't have a logical connection to each other? Now, the surrealist artists thought of Chagall as like the grandfather of their movement. They invited him to participate in exhibitions with them, but Chagall was like a man unto himself. He wasn't really interested. He just really liked incorporating these elements from his childhood. They become his own iconography, really. So we've got a goat up here whose body sort of turns into a fiddle. And then we've got the actual wedding ceremony in the middle ground here with a huppah. And then, of course, the Eiffel Tower. So he's taken a modern day wedding and he's turned it into this kind of Jewish folk tale in some ways, or a fairy tale, by incorporating these elements that are so important to him and familiar in terms of his artistic vocabulary. Now, almost 25 years later, Chagall is still painting lovers wrapped in each other's arms. And in this case, they have green faces. Those green faces that we saw going all the way back to the Jew in green from 1914. This is literally 50 years later. Those green faces are still around. We can see a much looser handling of paint. We've got this sort of serene blue color palette. Again, sort of feels like a nocturne here. But we've got all of these familiar elements of violinist, we've got the lovers, we've got animals, we've got flowers, and all of this is sort of like in an interior exterior shape. This sort of looks like a Parisian bridge to me, and maybe a little bit of a Russian Jewish village in the background. And all of this is accented by the slice of silver white moon on the right. So he's able to take these themes and still kind of reshape them, pair them together in, or sort of group them together in new and interesting ways. But there's always something that seems familiar when it comes to Chagall and these flying lovers. This one is from 1970. It's called Wedding in the Paris Sky. It's been nearly 50 years at this point since Marc Chagall met Bella and fell in love with her. And he is still living almost every day with that sense of unbelievable weightless joy that you get when you first fall in love. And to me, that just, that makes my heart soar to a certain point. So we've got our flying lovers, one of them with a green face. They're in Paris with the Eiffel Tower as a backdrop, this gorgeous bouquet of flowers over here, which could be a painting in and of itself. And so we see Chagall returning to these themes again and again and again. And I think the optimism in these themes is really something so extraordinary, because unfortunately for Chagall, his life was not always about weightless joy. So when it comes to Europe and the 1930s, we of course have to contend with the fact that there's a World War II and the rise of Nazism. So we're of course looking at an image of Adolf Hitler, who became the Chancellor of Germany in the early 1930s. Now, just as a reminder, before Hitler went into politics, he was a painter. He was twice rejected from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. And because of that, or maybe, well, probably because of that, he maintained very strong opinions about the nature of art and its role in society. Now, we won't get deep into his speeches or anything like that, but suffice it to say that he was radically opposed to modern art of all kinds. And because of him, the Nazis would sort of infuse their military campaigns with campaigns against modernism. And of course, seizing art was part and parcel to those military campaigns. So how does this impact our friend Marc Chagall? Well, in 1937, the Nazis seized about 20,000 works out of Jewish museums, or I'm sorry, German museums. The majority of these works were just modern works of modern art. But whenever they could, they would also take works by Jewish artists. And that included this painting here by Marc Chagall, simply called Snuff. And it was painted in 1912. It's a depiction of a rabbi using these kind of anti-naturalistic colors. And Chagall's almost a purposefully naive style, his approach to painting, which was part and parcel with modernism at the time too. Somebody like Adolf Hitler would have hated this because it wasn't a realistic painting. And because it also dealt with explicitly Jewish themes here. So the Nazis seized this work. They put it in a window display on a public street, and they placed next to it a dramatic sign saying, "Taxpayer, you should know how your money was spent." Now, this same year in 1937, the Nazis staged this massive exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition. This is the cover of the catalog to that show. Now, they sort of went through those 20,000 objects that they'd seized from museums, and they chose about 600 or so works of art to be a part of this degenerate art exhibition to show really to make the argument that modern art and Jewish art was causing the decay of modern society. So over here on the right, we can see Adolf Hitler and other Nazi Party leaders heading into that first exhibition of degenerate art, so-called degenerate art. Now, the Nazis took very special care to connect modern art to their anti-Semitic beliefs. They put out a pamphlet to coincide with this exhibition and declared that Dadaism, Futurism, Cubism, all the other isms of modern art are a poisonous flower of a Jewish parasitical plant grown on German soil. Examples of these will be the strongest proof for the necessity of a radical solution to the Jewish question. So basically, you have Hitler and the Nazis saying modern art is the reason why we should, essentially start exterminating the Jewish people. So beyond that, Jewish propagandists were, going on the radio and calling these artists garbage. They were dehumanizing them in every way possible. So when you go inside this exhibition, they grouped works together. I mean, the whole exhibition itself was very slapdash, but they would have rooms with different themes of them, and the titles of those themes on the wall. You can see Chagall's work included over here. Some of the themes were things like madness becomes method, or nature as seen by sick minds. In this photo, the title on the wall translates to the revelation of the Jewish racial soul. So we have an artist like Marc Chagall really right in the crosshairs of the Nazis. He represented essentially everything they hated. His identity, the way he painted. He was one of actually only 6 Jewish artists in this entire exhibition, but there were dozens of his works including at least one fiddler painting and this work over here from 1917 called Purim. When the German press had first seen Marc Chagall's paintings back in the 19-teens, they had raved over his paintings. But now under the Nazis, they made a mockery out of Chagall's art. They described his paintings as green, purple, and red Jews shooting out of the earth, fiddling on violins, flying through the air, representing an assault on Western civilization. So way to make somebody scary, right? So several of Chagall's works were burned by the Nazis, including a copy of his memoirs that he had written. And quite frankly, to me, it's remarkable that any of his paintings still survive, or that Marc Chagall himself survived World War II, because he was obviously characterized as an enemy of the Nazis. So he lived his life largely oblivious to this danger back in France. So he began to, once the Nazis took over Paris and France and Jews in prominent positions started losing their jobs, he and his wife became newly aware of the danger that they faced. But it was back in America, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, who we see over here on the left, and a young journalist named Varian Fry, who were alarmed at how dangerous the situation was for Jewish artists and intellectuals. And so they began this kind of covert operation to smuggle these people out of Europe to safety, to bring them to America. And so apparently when Varian Fry showed up to save Marc Chagall and said, I'm going to bring you to America, apparently Marc Chagall expressed with a little bit of hesitation, well, are there cows in America? And apparently he was visibly relieved when he was told that they were. When he came to America, he was given some pretty extraordinary opportunities as an artist. There was a New York ballet that invited him to paint the stage sets and to design the costumes for their production of a ballet called Alecko. The production of all of these things was done down in Mexico, and the ballet was first staged there. After its initial staging, the audience just went crazy over what Marc Chagall had produced, and he got 19 curtain calls. The same thing happened when the show was brought up to New York City. Curtain call after curtain call after curtain call. This man who had lived in the margins and impoverished for so much of his life, who was persecuted in a way that we can't possibly imagine, who had to live in exile. Imagine what it was like for him to stand on that stage and to receive those ovations again and again and again. Now, sadly for him, this period was not all of standing ovations. Like I said during the introduction, this is when he lost his wife. This is when Bella passed away. And it's so sad because she had a pretty standard viral infection that could have been treated with medicine. There was just a shortage of that medicine during the war. So he took a break from painting for several months, and this is one of the works that he created following her death. This is from 1945. It's called The Soul of the City. We can see him as the artist at the center here, referring to a painting. We'll get to the fact that it's a crucifix in just a moment, but then also it's another double face. And there's a green face here that's looking down at this kind of ghostly image of Bella over here. There's a figure in the foreground holding a rooster. There's a couple of references to livestock and the Jewish village that they grew up in. Now, all of this is to point out the fact of his heartbreak over the loss of his wife, but also his heartbreak of what was happening to Jews all over the world. His hometown of Vitebsk that had 240,000 people living in it was conquered by the Nazis during World War II in 1941. And following the Nazi invasion, only 118 people survived. His hometown was gone. His paintings now really were just memories of a place that no longer existed. So let me comment briefly on the crucifixion here. Now, we've already seen Marc Chagall sort of infusing different faith traditions into his paintings, but for him, he thought of Christ as a Jewish martyr. And to be able to show a crucifixion like this was an opportunity for him to call attention to the persecution of suffering of suffering European Jews during the 1930s and 40s. So it's really a painting that's all about loss. Now, in our last few moments, we can look at some incredible images that I think will bring us peace and bring us back to a state of joy too. So following World War II, Marc Chagall gets some major commissions all over the world, paintings in stained glass, and these are just such triumphant moments for him. He is awarded the commission in 1963 to paint the ceiling of the Paris Opera. It was not without controversy. There were plenty of people in Paris who thought that this was an opportunity that should have gone to a French artist and not a Russian Jewish immigrant. But in the end, Marc Chagall's artistic solution to what should be on the ceiling of the Paris Opera, I think, won people over. It certainly is not in keeping with this kind of ornate, very elaborate design from the late 19th century. If we look at it straight up like this, we can see that he's got several sections here dedicated to different composers, including Mozart, and Wagner, and Ravel, some of the dancers of the Paris Opera here as well. When it was first unveiled, there was a full show at the Paris Opera, but they didn't illuminate the ceiling. They just brought everybody in, and all of the dancers were on stage. They were, performing Mozart. The orchestra was performing Mozart, and in their very last bar of music, they raised the light on that mural. And once again, rapturous applause, and nobody spoke a bad word about Marc Chagall's artistic contributions to the Paris Opera after that. So he was invited to paint so many murals after that. And we might be familiar with some that are a little bit closer to home. At the Metropolitan Opera House at Lincoln Center, we can see on either side here, there are Chagall murals. We won't spend too much time on that. Here's just a quick glimpse at that. Believe it or not, there's very elaborate panels that cover these up during the day so that they're not exposed to light. But we can see in them his familiar repertoire, really, the dancers, the levitation, the references to the animals and the violinists that he grew up with. Now, he also begins working in stained glass in the last few decades of his life. And he's invited to create stained glass in North America, in Europe, and in Israel. And we are looking at 12 stained glass windows. Well, not all 12, but a cycle of 12 stained glass windows that he created for a synagogue in Israel. Just searching for the name of the synagogue. I just wanted to make sure I get it right. Well, each one of these windows is 11 by 8 feet. And there are 12 windows here relating to the 12 sons of Jacob and the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. And we can see that that Chagall, it almost makes sense that he's working in stained glass, because the brilliance of the color here with the light coming through this colored glass, it's like his paintings, but amplified. So he ends up donating these works, and he said, all the time I was working, I felt my mother and father looking over my shoulder, and behind them were Jews, millions of other vanished Jews of yesterday and 1,000 years ago. So he really thought of this as an opportunity for him to do service for the Jewish people. And so this is probably one of his most significant contributions when it comes to stained glass. But like I said, he did a number of really significant cycles all around the world. We have time for one more probably. This is his peace window at the United Nations. It's from 1964. It's 15 feet long by 12 feet wide. And it was created in honor of the UN's second Secretary General, who was killed in an airplane crash. But the themes here really relate back to his tried and true themes. I mean, you can see, I think this is a goat or a cow down here, but we also have a crucifixion, we have a snake, we have babes in mother's arms at the top and the bottom here. He's kind of mixing his different faith traditions here. And that's something that he had done throughout his life. As an adult, he was, as I said, he was not a practicing Jew, but through his paintings and his stained glass, he continually tried to suggest a more universal message using both Jewish and Christian themes. So we will wrap up with his death and legacy, just a couple of big ideas here. Marc Chagall passed away at the age of 97 in 1985. He was really the last surviving modern art master from Europe. I mean, Picasso had died, Matisse had died. He was the one who outlived them all, and he was buried alongside his last wife, Valentina Brodsky, in a multi-denominational cemetery in Provence, France. So even before he died, there was a museum dedicated to his honor in Nice, France, and it's called the National Museum of Marc Chagall Biblical Message. But even when it opened, he said, "My paintings represent not the dream of one people, but of all of humanity." And since he passed away, his life and his work have been celebrated in so many different ways. These are just two images from a musical called The Flying Lovers of Vitebsk. And it's a play concerning the life of Chagall and his lover, Bella. And you can see that they nailed the aesthetics here, right? I mean, we've got a fragmented background here. We've got the animals, we've got the colors, we've got the sense that they're going to be levitating too. You can see little snippets of this play on YouTube, and the music also seems just incredible. In 2014, during the closing ceremonies of the Sochi Olympics in Russia, there was a whole musical number that seemed inspired by Marc Chagall, with an upside down Russian village and floating figures like you see here. And then for all the Gen Xers out there, we probably remember that wonderful burning scene in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where the protagonist kisses his girlfriend in front of one of Chagall's windows at the Art Institute of Chicago. I always love to make note in terms of where an artist's work stands at auction. This is Marc Chagall's 1928 painting called The Lovers, which recently sold for about $30 million, if I'm remembering correctly, 28.5 million, which is hardly anything if you compare it to Picasso and Matisse. Sometimes I think that Chagall almost gets a bad reputation or is too easily dismissed for his sentimentality. Like all of modern art is supposed to be challenging in some ways. So we'll wrap up on tonight's program with just the idea that Marc Chagall really saw the worst of humanity during his very long life, from religious persecutions to revolutions to world wars and to the Holocaust. But he is a person and an artist that chose to create beauty and joy. I would say his optimism is nothing short of inspiring. And I hope after this hour with Marc Chagall, you all feel just a little bit lighter. So I will end it there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about Chagall. I'll start going through the chat and the Q&A here. Gianna, I might need your help in terms of unmuting people with their hands raised too. Chris, thank you so much for your kind words. Janine, oh, thank you for mentioning this. There's Transatlantic on Netflix that documents some of the artist's plight. Jan, thank you for your kind words over here too. And everybody who's writing very nice things, that really means a lot to me. I appreciate that. Karen asks, how many paintings in the Old Testament series did you say? Have they all survived, and where are they now? Okay. Great question, Karen. Those Old Testament pictures, those etchings, there were 105 of them. And because they're prints, they all still exist probably in some form somewhere, because multiple copies were made. And like I said, these are etchings, but the images that I showed you are watercolors over those etchings. And so I would imagine that they are, I'm not sure if there are museum collections that have the entire series, but I would say that they all still exist today. Thank you, everybody, for these very kind words. Let me take a look at the Q&A here too. What happens to him during the Nazi occupation in World War II? Joyce, thanks for asking that. I didn't get too deep into the specifics, but essentially he and Bella flee Paris. They're living in a different city. They are stripped of their citizenship. They are essentially arrested. They have no passports. They can't leave. I mean, he could have so easily been put on a train and taken off to a concentration camp. It is by sheer luck, really, that Varian Fry got to him in time with essentially like a forged visa to get him out of Europe. His daughter was not given one of those visas, and she had to find her own way to America. And there's a whole incredible story of her getting his works, or as many of his works as possible, on out of Europe on one of the last boats heading to America. I mean, this was all by the skin of their teeth. It's really incredible that he survived. Joyce also says that some of Chagall's paintings remind her of Frida Kahlo. That's an interesting connection. I think, especially those self-portraits, maybe. I think I'm gonna have to go back and think about that. Carol asks, did any of his family survive the war? So his daughter did, and I believe she, I think she inherited half of his estate when he passed away. So she survived well into adulthood. So he had his daughter Ida with his wife Bella, and then he had his son David with Virginia Haggard. But it doesn't seem like David, it doesn't seem like there was a strong relationship with David, because like I said, when he passed away, half of his estate went to his daughter Ida, the other half of his estate went to his second wife, Valentina Brodsky. So I think because he never married Virginia, and that was a shorter love affair for him, perhaps David wasn't part of his will. Jennifer asks, what was the name of the musical about Chagall that you mentioned? Well, it wasn't just about, the Chagall, the musical at the end. I was thinking Fiddler on the Roof for a second, but that's not about Chagall. This is the musical here. It's called The Flying Lovers of Vitebsk. And it's so hard for me to pronounce the name of his village, but I can write it here in the chat to everyone, just so that you can have it here. It's called The Flying Lovers This is a show that I know was staged during COVID, and they took special care to try and I think broadcast it to people who were at home. So I think that there's a lot of good resources related to that show online. And like I said, the visuals and the music are really incredible. Mary says, any thoughts as to why the green faces? What is green a symbol of? Well, that's a great question, Mary. And it's something that it's tough to sort of nail down for Chagall, because when it comes to green faces, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling all the way back to the Fauvists here. Fauvist artists like Matisse were really interested in the emotional connection to color. So, I mean, when you're feeling blue, he would literally paint blue. He was also, I'll leave that there. But for Chagall, it does seem like a green face has a different meaning. I think most of us today would probably associate it with a feeling of being sick or nauseous. But for him, it seems to have some sort of correlation to love. So many of the lovers that we looked at tonight have those green faces. I think that's his own green face there. And it's something that we see again and again, especially with our flying lovers a little bit later on. Here's some lovers here, and then lovers in the sky. So I don't have a firm, like a hard and fast interpretation on the green faces specifically, but it does seem like for him, it's almost a symbol of love. Mary says, obviously he had a major enemy, but did he have any personal enemies? He seems like just a delightful person. I would agree, Mary. He does seem really delightful. As far as I know, I can't think of any personal enemies. Towards the end of his life, he was more connected to other major artists like Picasso. There's a lot of great pictures of them with like their arms around each other, making art together, but they weren't besties. They weren't hanging around with each other all the time. But I don't think he necessarily thought of himself as being incredibly competitive with other artists. I mean, he had his own lane and he was so successful in it. So I don't think that he was somebody who was seeking out any sort of negative kind of interaction with anybody, especially after everything that he had lived through. If anybody knows differently, please feel free to jump in. And Jennifer asked, did he ever try to explain the symbolism in his paintings, in writings, or interviews? I'm sure at some point he probably gave some sort of limited understanding, but he was also an artist who very much wanted to leave it up to us to draw our own associations and conclusions when it came to his works of art. So I think most of us here tonight probably have a good sense in terms of what the meaning of all of this is. And I can tell you that art historians would have loved if he just said, a cow means this, a green face means this. But I think he always wanted to leave a little bit of mystery there and a little bit of excitement in questioning. So so there's no hard and fast decoding for him, unfortunately. Amit says the green and yellow looks like a negative photograph film. Oh, that's a really interesting association. I had not made that connection before. Thanks for adding that. I'll have to look into that. I think I got to all of the questions. I'm just scrolling back through here, and some people have seen some of the windows. It looks like William saw some of his stained glass windows in Zurich. I wish we could have spent more time on the windows because they really are exceptional. If you're dying to see some windows sort of locally, there's some windows in New York State that are not too far away in, I think, a chapel that was owned by the Vanderbilt family, if I'm not mistaken. They're breathtaking. They're gorgeous to see. Pocantico Hills, if you'd like to do a little day trip. But who wouldn't want to spend a little bit more time looking at Marc Chagall? He does seem like such a delightful person, and astonishingly so considering what he lived through. It's hard to imagine being such a despised figure by the Nazis. I can only imagine how terrifying something like that would have been. So thank you, everybody, for your attention, for your kind words, for sharing in additional ideas along the way. I really appreciate that. And I hope to see you next month for revolutionary architecture in New England. Definitely a subject that's a little closer to home, so that should be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jane, for this great presentation. And thank you everyone so much for joining in tonight. We always love putting on these programs, so thank you again. And as Jane said, please join us for next month's. It's going to be on May 18th, another Thursday night, Art on Thursdays at 7 p.m. over Zoom. So please register so that you can get the Zoom link. Of course, call the reference desk if you have any issues. We can always help you through that. Otherwise, please be sure to look out for your emails, either tomorrow or early next week. At some point, you'll get an email with the recording of this presentation. Again, thank you, Jane, so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.